Welcome. We are here today to talk about 5G for the IEEE Entrepreneurship 2021 IEEE 5G World Forum. If you want more information after this call, let me just give you right now to go to IEEE-WF-5G.org or futuredirections.ieee.org. I'm so excited to introduce our moderator for today, Samina Husain. Samina is a longtime IEEE volunteer. She holds or has held many roles, including the future directions for our IEEE 5G representative. She has a significant experience in communication in various formats and does business and relationship development both out of Montreal and of Switzerland. So we're very happy to have her as a volunteer today. And Samina, let me hand it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Randy, for the introduction, and welcome to everybody. Just a short information about myself. Thanks for that introduction. But yes, I am very active with IEEE, and one of the areas where I am active in addition to future directions and 5G is broadcast technology. I sit on their executive board, and my experiences in the last years and where I do currently consulting is working with telecom operators and service providers with IPTV and broadcasting products and market entry. So I'll be interested to understand how that also fits in within some of the products you're working with in the current 5G domain. But first, let me ask you all to do a short introduction about yourself. Tell us who you are, your organization, and a bit about your solution. And I'm going to start with you first, Peter.
Yes, good morning, Samina. Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to this forum. My name is Peter Dougherty. I am CEO of MantisNET. We are an early stage company that develops observability tools for 5G systems. We are all about providing real-time intelligence for all form of operational DevOps management orchestration systems. So our technology, quite frankly, provides deep observability and visibility into the underlying 5G infrastructure. So exposing all kinds of deep telemetry for the analytic workflows that are used to monitor and secure those systems. So it's an exciting time to be in such a market. We very few times in our careers do we have the opportunity to participate in a market size of hundreds of billions of dollars. So it's very exciting, and there's a lot of new developments going on in this space.
Thank you. Sounds very interesting.
My name is Amit Jain. I am the co-founder and chief commercial officer of Verana Networks. So Verana Networks builds radio access network equipment focused on millimeter wave spectrum. Our company is based out here in Massachusetts with offices in Massachusetts and in Bangalore. We're mainly building this product for the service provider market. Most of our team has worked in the service provider space, building a radio access network infrastructure for a number of years. Previous startups, we have done 3G and 4G equipment. And today we are building a really innovative 5G infrastructure solution.
Jad, can I ask you to please do a short introduction?
Yeah, for sure. So Jad Meouchy, co-founder and CTO of BadVR. My background is in coding and startups and entrepreneurship and all that fun stuff. With BadVR, it's sort of a fusion of experience and passion. So we do data visualization using augmented reality and virtual reality. So we find interesting and creative ways of looking at information at scale. One of the products that we have is called C-Signal. You put on an AR headset and you can see radio spectrum. So you can actually see wireless signals in the room. You can see 5G, 4G, you can compare them against each other. You can see interference patterns. It's kind of like X-ray vision. And so obviously that has a lot of implications for planning and deployment, as well as diagnostics and analysis. And then, of course, if you're looking for transmissions in a room that maybe are or are not supposed to be there, it has implications in that industry as well.
Very interesting. Maybe I'll start with a question to you, Chad, about your product on the ARVR side. Just from a commercial perspective, are these headsets meant for an enterprise to use it, or is it a commercial product for individuals? So can I go out and buy one and then set up my Wi-Fi at home and use one of these tools?
For the headset experience, it's really designed for enterprise or for heavy duty commercial use. The headsets can be costly from a consumer's perspective. They are coming down in price and they're becoming more accessible. But we did build a version that works through a smartphone, AR. So obviously it's not quite the same, holographic experience, but you can hold up a phone and that's your window into that environment, and to see sort of it overlaid in that way, kind of like a Pokemon Go type of an experience, except you're looking at radio signals and transmissions. So I would say that yes, it is accessible to many different types of people, but it is designed for the sort of future experience of holographic projection.
Leading in from that, Peter, your product is also about analytics and probably also has value in deployment and in a 5G network. How does that marry with the VR product that we've just talked about?
So it does very nicely, because in the 5G space, as we know, 5G is essentially it's software running on hyperscale systems, private or public network, private or public cloud infrastructure. That's the first point. The second point is these systems are very complex because they're typically they're based on microservices-based architectures. So in the microservices world, in these cloud infrastructure, all your resources, your network functions are ethereal, meaning they're spun up in one location on one node on the cloud, in one instance, spun down and reinstantiated somewhere else. So being able to observe where those network functions are currently residing, the status, the state of those, the health of those network functions is extremely important. So we provide some form of open source visualization tools that allow users to view it in 3D space, to view the state of their network, the state of the network functions, et cetera, in 3D. But that's extremely important. And that's probably the biggest reason why our customers come to us, because we provide the ability to provide a dynamic topology view of those resources in real time and continuously, and stream that information and feed analytic workflows, but also visualization tools. So it's extremely important because the 5G infrastructure is so dynamic, and it requires a new set of tools here.
So it's not just the deployment, but it's the ongoing maintenance and the operations of the very broad network.
Absolutely. And most network operators are just beginning to scratch the surface with advanced services using network slicing and new mobility services, et cetera. And it's just going to get worse. As you know, there are literally just in the core of the 5G network, there were over 24 different network function types. And again, given the ephemeral nature, I apologize, of those resources and the way they're deployed, it requires new tools, new analytic workflows to keep track of those.
Yes, and it just increases. It's very dense, and so keep on increasing. So it's not going to get problematic, but it's going to become very, very intense, and you need a solution to have that. Yes. Amit, your product, will it be able to feed into such tools to enable your operators to have such a view when they're deploying, as you're looking at the radio access side?
Sure. So in a way, what we are building is agnostic to the kinds of tools that carriers would like to use. Our focus right now is at helping carriers build these, getting them the right equipment so they can build these networks. So I mean, despite all the talk about 5G, the actual deployment of 5G has been relatively limited. Even situations where carriers have claimed that they have nationwide 5G rollouts, they are more or less repurposing their 4G network and unfortunately calling it a 5G network, getting the marketing and getting people to sign up for 5G service. But otherwise, we're quite early in terms of building out these networks. And at least my view has been that for 5G to really offer all these new services, it needs an order of magnitude increase in the amount of capacity that it can deliver. So if you're going to do 20 or 30% better than an LTE network, then why bother spending like hundreds of billions of dollars doing that? So if this massive investment is going to be made, there has to be a 10x, 50x increase in the level of capacity. Often that requires new spectrum to be deployed, and building out a new network with new equipment. So we are focused on helping carriers do that and do that as cost effectively as possible. And yes, once they're building this network, I think as Peter mentioned and Jad also mentioned, you'll need new tools to understand, maintain, analyze the network, and so on. But I think first they have to go out and get serious and build the network. So.
And that leads well into the next question. So I'll start back with you again, Amit. Where do you see the biggest challenge for you as a startup with this new product in the current 5G environment?
The part of the ecosystem in which we are playing is really concentrated. So today, I remember when I started working back in cellular equipment over 20 years ago, there were over a dozen network infrastructure companies. I mean, even in the US, we had, there was like Lucent, Motorola, Nortel. You would have several companies in Europe, several countries, several infrastructure companies in Japan, in Korea, and China. And over the last 2 decades, the market has consolidated. So now we're at a stage where there is a very small number of very large infrastructure companies that dominate the market landscape and basically make decisions on what products can be available and which ones are just very low on their prioritization scheme. So as a startup playing in that space, one of our biggest challenges is to figure out the products that are right for our customers, not for every customer, but at least for a set of large customers that these large equipment vendors are unwilling or unable to build, and then bring these products to market again at very large customers. So it's in a way competing against very large established incumbents, and then selling these products to large established service providers.
Having worked for Nortel Networks in my career in the past, and it doesn't exist anymore, and I completely understand how the dynamics and the arena of the industry has changed. But right. As you say, there are few players, they're large, and they're very well embedded into the customer. So coming in as a smaller player, perhaps with a brilliant idea, it's still difficult. So I wish you lots of success there. Maybe we'll come back around and I'll ask you a question about what you've done with proof of concepts with your customer. But I'm going to go to you, Peter, next, and just lead from that question. Where do you see the challenges in the sense of analytics? It's a little different. There are actually many companies that are involved in doing deep learning, data analytics, and bringing solutions. So how do you find that as a challenge, or how do you address that?
Yeah, it's a challenge from the respect of getting the mind share of our customers. We view ourselves as a product-led company, so we intently focus on listening to the customers and their needs. But it's a pretty noisy market at this point. You have some conflicting messages, as we just heard. On the infrastructure side, there are a decreasing number of vendors, but when it comes to the underlying software functions within the 5G network, there's been an explosion of tools, vendors, etc. Now, and combined with that, you have players like Microsoft, Google, Amazon getting involved, so the hyperscalers getting involved. And so for a small company, it's increasingly hard to get your message heard. So we try to carve out a very solid foundational message around observability, that we have expertise in 5G protocols, and we have the unique ability to embody that in our software so that we can uniquely extract telemetry that's very useful to the analytic workflows. But it's very difficult to get your message across as a small company. Having been through the fundraising process a number of times, I once had a VC prospect I was pitching to saying that carriers are where innovation or small innovative companies go to die. That used to be the mantra there. But I think with 5G, and again, we're still in the nascent phase, I think, of 5G deployments, because as the point was made earlier, some of the 5G deployments are repurposed 4G. But the opportunity for 5G is going to open up a lot more opportunities for software companies, analytic companies such as ourselves, to provide value, but it's still a challenge to carve out a unique, innovative message, especially for us around observability, because it's such a noisy space at this time.
Yes, and also in the past, often it was the bigger companies that did internal development. So your competition was already inside. And I believe now it's mostly outside because cost and lean organizations exist.
And there's a very strong not invented here culture, even in the service providers. Many of them are becoming systems integrators to a large respect, and they're having to let go of their previous inclination to develop technology or have to define it themselves. They have to be more open to looking for new and innovative technologies that can actually help their businesses. But that's a cultural shift for a lot of these big network operators.
Absolutely. Jad, come to you now. I mean, I have to admit, I know a little bit about ARVR from a gaming perspective, but from the tool that you're bringing that's new, what is your challenge? Is it about really convincing a service provider that this is a tool that they can really use? And how do you see that?
Yeah, no, I would say that they definitely see the value because we're opening up a type of experience or a type of problem solution that does not exist without this AR/VR technology. So it's something that they've wanted to do, and it speeds up the process that they would follow for doing, let's say, a signal propagation analysis, where they'll go into an environment, collect a lot of measurements, and then take it to an analytics workflow and run a whole process on it, and then be able to say, okay, here's what it was at that spot, in the football stadium where we're installing 5G, and that could be 3 days later. Whereas with the alternative, using this future tech, you go there, you put on the magic goggles, and you see it instantaneously. And it fundamentally changes the pace at which they can do it, but also the cost and the type of technical expertise required. So we're seeing a lot of demand for it. The sort of flip side of all of it is that they say, the carriers, the telecoms will say, okay, how can we use this to help sell 5G to the stadium? And so we're just put in a very strange position where we're coming in to help the carrier, and they're asking us to help sell the concept of 5G to the consumer public or the enterprise public. And so it's that's a challenge we face, is trying to figure out how we're in the middle of these titans, helping them both to get up. But we're 16 people. We're trying to figure out how to make the company exist next year. So we're not thinking about how $100 billion are going to flow across. Just thinking about how to make cool tech and find customers.
Well, it's definitely a cool tech, but I think also some of the questions that you're getting is indicative of perhaps that 4G still does a lot for us. And then the question is, how do you bring that value out of 5G? And does this tool help show some of that value add? So perhaps, yeah, definitely a challenge on both sides, not only your product, but your customer who has to have this out there. I'm going to come back to you, Amit, because I know that you've been involved in your organizations in other startups. You have been very engaged with customers. Maybe talk a little bit about your customer experiences today with Verana, and perhaps a proof of concept or trials that you've done with your customers. How have those experiences been for your company?
Sure. See, I feel that whenever we are doing a trial, and we have to kind of think through what is it that we are trying to prove, and will the trial accomplish it? So, for instance, like right now, we are building this millimeter wave 5G radio access network system. And imagine that if I had just done a trial of, we go to a lab, we set up a base station and a handset, and then we transmit some data, and we say, look, a gigabit. It's not going to impress anybody, because the thing is, customers have already seen trials in which they've been seeing it for a few years, in which the larger vendors will go up to them and say, look, a gigabit per second. So we have actually avoided doing trials that are a lot of work for us, but actually do not provide evidence about the value proposition that we have. And most of our focus, and this has been true for some of my previous companies as well, has been on trying to understand what is a critical problem that the customer is facing, and look at in a way, a critical business problem that the customer is facing, and then basically keep on revising our product spec to the point where it is clear to them, basically where they agree that if you build X for me, it will solve a massive problem for my business. And that requires multiple iterations. And further business problems that service providers are often, there are multiple organizations involved within their group. So just like I think as Chad was describing a moment ago, they have these VR goggles, and I think they're looking at how they can solve a problem for the designer of the system. But the actual problem that, as he's discovered, is the problem of selling a 5G system to a stadium. So it's a different, it's actually, as an entrepreneur, we may have one perception of the problem, but as we go through this engagement process, we discover that there's a completely different problem that they want to solve. And that has been my experience as well. So whenever we are doing all this initial work, it's more on discovering the problem, finding people within the service provider who for whom the problem is really painful, turning them into supporters of our solution, and then assembling a team which has the credibility that it can build what we basically put on paper and convince them to do, get their buy-in, and then go and build the product, rather than, in a way, spending a lot of time building small demos, because it doesn't. Those in itself will not prove the point. I think a lot of conceptual stuff can actually help in basically figuring out the business case, and that's where a lot of our focus has been at Verana and at some of my previous startups as well.
Makes a lot of sense, of course. I mean, you have to have that balance between a proof of concept and the actual, what the customer really needs, and listening. Often in my experiences in broadcast, we need to demonstrate something. So we build, but then we have to keep revising. So your point is very valid.
Correct. Yeah, so we normally have, our approach has been to start the building process after we have some level of product market fit, if you may, around the concept, because the carriers also realize that it takes a while to get a solution deployed within a service provider. So to an extent, even if you had something perfectly working today, it is not that they can buy it. They can buy it tomorrow and start using it the day after. Even if you have something working today, by the time you sell it, it's going to be 2 years in any case. So you might as well kind of start the engagement. And this would be my advice to other entrepreneurs as well. If they're going to engage with service providers, start the engagement early. You can start it around concepts. Carriers are pretty open to, you have to find the right organization, of course. So don't go to the deployment organization, go to the R&D organization, run your concept by them, get their buy-in, build a set of supporters within those organizations, and then collaborate with them in terms of building the solution and getting it deployed in their organization.
Peter, your
Yes.
experiences with customers, I think we've got some very interesting input from Amit. What would be your comments?
Well, similar to Amit, it's about finding the right audience, number one. And sometimes in the larger organizations, you may have to touch a number of different organizations, whether it's the R&D organization, whether it's the data science team. We have within these various organizations, you have one group doing management and orchestration. They're responsible for management orchestration, another group responsible for deployment. So it's a matter of persistence in some case, identifying the right audience. I think Amit brought up another good point. Never confuse a demo with a POC. A demo is great. You can set it up in a sandbox or whatever and demonstrate the capabilities of your product or service. But the POC, the proof of concept, is extremely important when talking to service providers. And there too, I would just add to what Amit said, is set the expectations appropriately. We're all entrepreneurs. We tend to go into these engagements very starry-eyed. We can do this, this, and this. Set the baseline, as to what you can do, how you can impress your target audience, your customers, with the capabilities you have today, and build on that. Have an open, collaborative relationship with the service provider, saying, here's a fundamental set of capabilities we provide. We can also implement the following capabilities, but we want to work with you collaboratively to get there. So find the right audience, set the expectations, and then be very collaborative. Because again, Amit, sales cycles, as we all know, are very long. Sometimes you have a golden moment where you meet a need. Say, we found on numerous occasions where a DevOps team had a specific issue they were trying to solve, and they could buy some licenses for our software and start using it immediately. But by far and away, in large organizations, it's fortuitous when it happens, but for the long term big wins with the service providers, it's a process that you just have to be very focused on.
Thank you. That's excellent advice. I think also it's not just about that which organizations, but also to convince those organizations to talk to each other, because within a big company, you end up with silos and you're convincing one when the other just doesn't know. So it's a lot of work, and it's finding the right audience in multiple ways. Chad, have you done some, I'm going to say, demos or proof of concepts with these stadiums, for example, or customers in which you've learned some new things about your products that you need to adjust?
Oh yes. So we're very hands-on. So we and our product usually leads our marketing. So we love to put people in demos and then have them basically tell us how they might imagine using it for very specific use cases. So we listen very carefully to a lot of things that they say. We churn it a little bit and refine it to try to understand what they really need, which isn't necessarily what exactly they're asking for. And then we'll present them with a plan around a KPI, around a performance indicator, something quantitative about how can we take this one metric and give you an order of magnitude improvement. And so for one particular scenario, for one particular customer, it was about planning a very large network infrastructure it was basically an airport. So it was an area that is below an airport. So in this particular airport, there's a whole little miniature city underneath the airport, and that's where they need the connectivity. The connectivity above, where all the consumers run around and people rush to their flights, that's provided by some other service, but underground, that's where they really need connectivity to do business. So it was a unique challenge of, you need to go into an environment where you're not going to be able to physically access the environment. You're going to have to train somebody on how to operate the equipment, how to operate in that environment. We're not going to give you schematics, floor plans, names, number, nothing. You have nothing, but here's the parameters. Can you build to that spec? And so that was the challenge, was designing something a little bit in the dark. So we had to make it versatile and we had to make it flexible. And that was the design constraint. And the one, I guess, saving grace of all of it was we designed it to have minimal to no training. So it was being that it's a virtual holographic type of an experience, we have holographic training on board. So there's almost a person, a virtual person explaining, okay, now you do this, and now you can do that, and here's how you do this. And so we moved the training away from person to person. We put it into the experience and integrated it into the application, and that ended up being a big win for just engagement in general. So when people who didn't really have an investment in the project that we had would just pick it up and run with it, it would just work for them, and they could kind of figure it out and play with it until they figured it out. And if the instruction manual is 3 pages longer, we may never have had a successful engagement. But because we made it flexible and we cut the learning curve down a lot, even just for a POC, that made the difference. That got our engagement, and the engagement drove the KPIs, drove the numbers.
Excellent. And on top of that, you probably had to design something with a lot of cybersecurity protection without knowing what you're actually looking at in a building physical. As airport, I can imagine that's quite a challenge. I'm just looking at the time, so I'm going to do a couple of questions and try to bring to some closure. I want to bring in a question from broadcasting. So as you know, 5G also has implications for broadcasters. And my question is, do you see your product, and I'll start with Amit, how do you see your product fit in with a broadcaster or a broadcasting environment?
So far, I have to admit, we haven't thought about how our product would necessarily fit in for broadcasters. Now, one thing I do see is that like one of the reasons a lot of carriers are interested in doing 5G in, say, millimeter wave spectrum is to offer fixed wireless access services, basically get into the home internet business and enable, once you have these kind of like multi-hundred megabits per second or gigabit speeds, then these networks can be easily used for high definition streaming. So in that sense, it would, I think the availability of 5G would turn a lot of wireless carriers into competitors relative to broadcasters rather than it being more like a complementary offering right now. But to be honest, we haven't seriously thought about how we could take our product or technology into the broadcast space.
Peter?
So when it comes to broadcast, our value add, and we have been asked to look at this, is ensuring quality of service, providing quality of service metrics to where we can now introspect and provide round trip latency measurements for real-time communications, et cetera. So deep in the tech stack, but when it comes to broadcast, especially when you get to, obviously high definition 4K beyond, where the bandwidth requirements are increasing, where the producers are less likely to use dedicated point-to-point communications equipment and more likely to use public networks, they're going to need to ensure the bandwidth and latency to be able to efficiently produce content there. So deep in the tech stack, but it's a value, and we have been asked and are working on a project where we're just embedding our agents in endpoint devices to do latency measurements for that reason.
Interesting. Jad?
Yeah, with regards to broadcast, I would say the primary use case we would see would be in helping to understand where to position equipment in a large environment or in an environment prone to noise or interference. So again, something like a large football stadium or any type of stadium, understanding where to position all that equipment so it's not interfering with the consumer's or the customer's experience. And so getting all the antennas situated correctly, getting all the equipment situated, minimizing the capital expenditure of the equipment by optimizing the placement of it. So bringing the cost of the installation down by being able to visually place it, so it's evenly distributed, or whatever the metric may be, or whatever the parameters may be. I would say that's our primary use case for broadcast industry.
I mean, I think with the broadcast industry, private networks for 5G or 5G private networks will be more relevant in the area of production and post-production versus the actual distribution currently to the home. And all of your products could bring some value there. Again, in a private network, I should be agnostic, Peter. If they can still look at your tool on a private network, your ARVR and the equipment that you're doing emit in that private environment where they need to do all that production, get all that data, and then have a point-to-point to the final studio to do whatever the next step is from a media perspective. So there's certainly an opportunity there once we have much more live sports and we have all of that happening, because that's really where the biggest thing with media is live events, of which we haven't had a lot of in the last little while. Yes, I think there are interesting opportunities also, not only with the 5G, and our favorite use of devices and phones, but also for the broadcast industry. My last little question around is going to be about standards, because standards is something relevant. It defines also how your products become accessible across the globe, across agnostic products. So I'll start with Amit. Are you involved with IEEE standards, or are you involved in the standard space regarding your product and its development?
We actually build all our products as per 3GPP standards. So we're mostly, as you know, focused on the radio layer. And I think most of the standardization for that is being done by 3GPP. There are parts of our product that relate to just IP networking, and we do stay close to IEEE standards for those. But yes, I do feel that for the service provider space, having products that are standards compliant is absolutely essential. And especially so if you're selling hardware products that are going to stay in their network for a very long time, I think if you don't have something that is standards compliant, it's just not going to fly.
Peter?
Oh, yes. Standards are supremely important in this space, right? We live and breathe by the 3GPP standards, writing our code, writing our agents, developing our tools around them. So supremely important, both from the respect of our business, but also I think in terms of the overall marketplace, having equipment now being able to have heterogeneous environments to where you can have multi-vendor, multiple vendors have their gear be able to seamlessly integrate. That's hugely important there, especially when it comes to the internals of the 5G networks, the various network functions and interoperation of them. So very important. As a small company, we're primarily a consumer. In previous lives, I had been on various standards committees, spent a lot of time with it, but now as a user and consumer, we have full and deep appreciation for those standards.
I feel like we end up writing more than we're reading on the standards these days. So we have unique requirements sometimes that a standard may not exist for. So we're just sort of at the beginning of all of this, building out a lot of IP and all that. But from a integration standpoint, we're often writing specifications for a major headset provider, for example, telling them, hey, here's how this network interface needs to work in order for us to be able to deliver this solution to insert Giant Telecom. So we'll write you the spec, you build to that spec, and then we'll figure out how to publish that later. But that's what we need if you want to, sign on to this big deal. So I feel like we're probably more on the writing side than the reading side. But we do all the reading, of course, but we sometimes have to do some of the writing too.
It's tough being a small player and being on the table with the standards group. I have done that with previous companies. It's hard to be the influencer, but it's very important to learn to what's happening and the direction things are going, so you can ensure that your product is going in the right way for the overall market. But I do invite you all to look at IEEE Standards Association broadness in what we're doing. I think there may be some opportunities there on the 5G side. I completely understand that 3GPP is the place to be, but IEEE also does some very interesting work in standards. And I'm just going to close off and then hand off with to Randy, but I do also invite you all to become members of IEEE if you're not. It's a great organization. There are lots of interesting things we're doing on ARVR with an initiative called Digital Realities, which I'm very much involved in which we are looking at all aspects of ARVR and IR and how it works in education, industry, all of those areas which you may find interesting, Jad. And of course, on the network side, we have a future networks group that looks at everything on standards and the deployments of 5G. So I hope that you have that opportunity. I thank you very much for the question and answer. I think some of the things we've talked about will help future startups or current startups that are in the area, listening to some of the advice you've given on how to work on your product, what the value it is for proof of concept or demos. I think that's very relevant in how they do their deployments. I wish we had more time because I think there could be many more things we could talk about on your products and the depths of it. But I am going to stop here and give the floor back to Randy to close this discussion. Thank you.
As always, thank you, Samina. My list of notes is very long and extensive, so instead I'm going to forward all of you to resources. So a couple of the resources that were mentioned that you can follow up and learn more about: entrepreneurship.ieee.org for the IEEE entrepreneurship community, futurenetworks.ieee.org for future networks, meaning 5G and beyond. Of course, Samina just mentioned digital reality. That's again, digitalreality.ieee.org, and the Broadcast Technology Society, which is bts.ieee.org. So you can follow up on all of those. IEEE, as you might have guessed, if you've not already deep in us, is very broad and very deep. And there's an engineering technology or medicine related technology community for you. And we can really help you to connect with other people like the founders on this call. In addition, please follow up and follow the websites on the screen right now to learn more about Verana, BadVR, and MantisNET, because obviously these founders are very deep in their space and know the entire spectrum of what they're doing to be successful. So thank you all for your time and effort, and we look forward to seeing you on future entrepreneurship sessions.